There we go. All right.
Hello.
Hey, hey. We see people.
Hello.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Hey, Amanda and Leah and Kill.
Hello.
Hopefully we'll have some more folks trickling in here momentarily. So how do you want to field questions, Jill? Do you want to have them shooting through the Q&A?
Right, that would be good.
Okay, and I'll keep an eye on it.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, should we go ahead and get started?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started, and folks will probably trickle in, but in respect of everyone's time, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, well, great. Well, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the business of craft beverage, hiring, people, HR, and management tools. I'm Jill Sparks. I work at the Small Business Center with Dwayne Adams and Daphne Carson. And this is the last in a 5-part series regarding the business of craft beverage. So again, we are excited you're here and thank our panelists. I'll have them introduce themselves in just a moment for sharing their time and their expertise with us. And if you have attended any of these in the past, or if this is your first one, we developed this series, or actually Dwayne and Jess did, to discuss the different approaches to the growth and development of various areas of business. And a lot of entrepreneurs are DIYers. They're going to do it themselves and they're just going to plug on through. However, in order to grow their business and maintain their well-being, at some point as they're growing, they need to hire and delegate. And that does not always mean hiring a mini me and another mini me and another mini me. So during this panel, we'll discuss best practices for hiring, performance accountability, harnessing a diverse, inclusive, and equitable culture, and the importance of communications and connectivity in the workplace. So a lot of great information that's going to be shared today. And with that, we'll turn it over to the panelists to briefly introduce themselves. And we'll start with Jessica.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Jess Reeser. I am the owner and CEO of Burial Beer Co. And for those of you that aren't familiar with us, we're a brewery that started out really tiny, a 1-barrel brewery, which is basically you brew 2 kegs at a time. And it's myself, my husband, a good friend of ours. And so we were the only people who worked there for the first year and a half. Now we have 75 employees and 3 locations, and we brew 10,000 barrels a year now. So we've been open for going on 8 years. So yeah, thanks again for being here, and I'm excited to have this conversation today.
Kevin?
Okay, I'm Kevin Young. I am I own my own business. It's called Strategic Human Resources Business Partner. And I specialize in helping people get up and running through HR practices. I'm also the Employee Relations, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager for the Biltmore Estate. And I'm from Hendersonville, North Carolina, and I help everybody I can. So I'm glad to be here, glad to see you here, and hopefully the information we impart upon you will help you in your endeavors.
Thank you. Derek?
Hey everybody, my name is Derek Allen. I've got a law firm, Allen, Stahl, and Kilbourne. I work with lots of folks on my grid here. Service counsel to Burial Beer, service counsel, and a board member for Asheville Brewers Alliance. Hi, Leah, how are you? I've done work with Kevin through Leaf and some other HR products or projects. And Puff and I serve on the North Carolina Craft Beverage Museum. Our firm works with startups to breweries with international distribution and everything in between. Really have a sweet spot in my heart for the startup business and the small ones. Barrel's just a great example that started, being open on, a couple hours on Friday, a couple hours on Saturday to what they've done now, really becoming an iconic brand in the US. So happy to help and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, well, great. Well, let's start with our first question. We've got someone else waiting in the waiting room that's going to join us. I think, did I do that right, Dwayne? Okay. Great. Hey, Lacey. So with our first question, and just jump in as you answer, what role does HR play within an organization? So in other words, why is HR management important to the entrepreneur and to an organization?
I'll take the first part because I think it will lead right into things that Kevin and Jess in particular will want to talk about. And with startup breweries in particular, and any startup business, but especially breweries, what you said earlier, which is everybody wants to do it themselves. I kind of start with the assumption that that's the case. And I have a short list of things that I tell them, don't try to do this yourself, get a professional involved. If you want to apply for your ABC permit or your TTB permit, or you want to go out there and try to do the installation of your brew house, like go have at it. Like you might not be able to do as quickly or as efficiently as someone who does it all the time, but those are things that can't really screw up at the end of the day. Things that you can screw up, you need to get professionals involved. And I tell them the same list pretty much every time. And that list is make sure you have a professional looking at your lease or your ownership documents, because if you don't get it right and something goes wrong, you end up in a piece of litigation that sinks the business. Your operating agreement, if you have anyone other than you and maybe your significant other, get an operating agreement, because if something goes wrong and it screws up, then you end up losing the business. Trademark protections, anything that you can't live without, make sure you get it protected. If you can live without it, who cares? If you can't and you have to give it up 2 or 3 years from now, that's going to be a bad thing and you may lose the business. And the last one is employee relations and employee handbook in particular, because if you screw up the employment pieces, it might not matter on the first day or the second day or the first year even, but at some point you're going to want to fall back on solid employee policies. And it's the easiest to put it in an employee handbook, employee manual. That way you know that you're protected. And if you have the right professionals in place doing that, then they'll give you semi-annually or annual updates for you to fill in those pages, so that you've got in advance these mitigation of risk measures already there. And so you're creating facts that give you cover in case something goes wrong. Then I look to folks like Kevin and folks like the owner to say, hey, make really good hiring decisions. And that's why I tag it off to y'all, and y'all say, here's what we do to make sure we don't hire bad employees.
Yeah. Oh, Kevin, you can go ahead.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, all very well put, Derek. Where were you when we first started hiring? I'm just kidding. Basically, we, as I mentioned, we started very small, and so over the years, I can kind of speak to some of the hardships that we experience as employers hiring employees, because we did not have the foresight in the beginning to put some of those like HR management tools in place. One of the big things for us was accountability. So it was incredibly challenging at one point in our business, and accountability is always challenging because it's usually like, awkward conversations and et cetera. But, it makes it easier when you have expectations in place through job scopes, through performance review processes, through weekly meetings and communications, and through things like a handbook. So documentation being so huge, write-up policies, things like that, because it sets the expectation for the employee and for the employer and or the manager. And so when things come up that might require disciplinary action, you can point to something. You can point to something that was discussed, and you can feel confident that you were not transparent from the beginning, and that you also provided the tools and the resources to that person. It's really, really challenging to hold someone accountable when you feel insecure as a manager or employer as to whether or not you've given them the tools for success. So that's definitely where HR management has helped us over the years, and helped us kind of backtrack a bit from some of the lack of again, foresight and planning with regards to employees.
Well, a little bit about my background. I've come out of manufacturing. I've worked for some large companies. So documentation process and those things are very important to Fortune 500 companies that I have worked for. So I think that Derek and Jessica have hit on some very good things, because part of what I always tell people is your employee manual absolutely helps you set your culture. And if you don't start out on those right tracks at that point, your culture has a chance to go off track. And then you have bad hiring processes, you make bad hiring decisions because you don't have your culture established. And one of the ways that you do that is through your employee manual. The other thing about culture is you have to decide that before you even go into somewhere. Most companies jump into it and then try to figure out what their personality is going to be. So if you can have a consensus on what you want to look like, then that helps build your culture, and it also helps towards those other things. Documentation is so important. Those are the ways that, anytime you document something, I like to tell people, if you have a documentation process for corrective action, then if you have coaching built into that, use your coaching documents, because it gives you the opportunity to tell someone on the other end of the process, which is litigation, that you've given these employees an opportunity to change their behavior. And we don't like Derek in that. But that's true. You got to have your documentation in place. And if you don't show that you are giving the tools, like Jessica said, giving them the tools, the resources, and mostly the opportunity to curb behavior, then your chances in litigation in court are slimmer. So,
and to echo that, litigation, the only winners in litigation are people like me. And you can take care of an issue on the front end through having good handbooks, and then having good policies, and actually following the handbook, and heading those things off. And you can spend amounts that end with 2 zeros and maybe three zeros. If you mess up something like that and you find yourself in a piece of litigation like we're talking about on an HR issue, a small business can just kiss it goodbye, because you're done. Like, you're done. Like, small business can't withstand a $50,000 or $100,000 litigation matter. Like, that's no good.
yeah.
Right,
And
right.
it's never easy when you do that either. I mean, like he says, if you're starting up, even for a large companies, I mean, 50 grand is not chump change. It's something we look at. You become a target of that. People understand that you might be vulnerable in those areas. So if you got those areas tight when you begin, and it becomes known, and you execute your policies with consistency and fairness, then that gets around too. And you become known as a fair and consistent company by applying your policies. So and applying your policies and having those policies from an HR perspective really takes the guesswork out of how you go about meting out your corrective actions. It's because there's a prescribed way that you do it. Everybody follows the same process, and no one can say anyone's getting and treating any differently. And then you have all the other impactors around what are your policies and procedures equitable and inclusive. And that's a whole nother subject. But those are the basics that I like to talk about in those things. And Jessica, I really like when you said set expectations. Because if a person doesn't know what is expected of them, how can you hold them accountable for those expectations? So that's the basic thing that a lot of organizations don't do. And a lot of organizations that are already involved in their processes don't sustain it that well. So to me, setting expectations is one of the largest things you can do around making your business successful.
Thank you. And I don't think folks can hear this enough, but thinking about these policies, procedures, that employee handbook, even if it is just one person or two people starting out, to do that ahead of time, because that will save you time and money on the front end. And we can't repeat that enough all the time. And so with some of our questions, you've already addressed that. With this, as the entrepreneur business owner understands this, how do they go about the process of developing a comprehensive HR package for their organization?
Go ahead, Derek.
I would say for me, the hard, the parts of putting in an employment handbook, employee manual for us, we do them on a flat fee. We do a million of these things for our startup breweries. And again, that's just the tool to deal with it. You as the operator, the owner, have to, apply it. And then if you get stuck and run into issues, then perhaps you call, HR specialist to come in at that point. And that HR specialist might be someone like Kevin, or it might be an attorney. Hopefully it doesn't get there because you've dealt with it on the front end. But that's really the first step, is, putting that in place, because, just like they were talking about, Jess and Kevin, that defines who you are and sets expectations and acts as the rules of the road. And you look at your manual, like, how do we address the situation? And it ought to be covered in there.
I remember what Derek says. A lot of times we just forget, and starting out with that employee manual and getting that thing started. When you get one from Derek, he's absolutely right. You're gonna want to customize it for your own use. And that's where a professional will come in and help you continue to set your culture and how it's going to work. So you might have these overarching policies that are legal, but like I tell people, in South Carolina, I ride a motorcycle, but in South Carolina, it's legal to not wear a helmet, but that doesn't give you the proper protection. So we want to put a helmet on your policy manual so that you have the proper protection geared for what you're doing in the industry. And that's the value of having someone come in, assessing that, and having really a periodic assessment of that in an audit to be sure that you're doing what you need to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, if Derek and Kevin were with us in the beginning, things probably would have looked a little differently. I took the DIY road, so I can speak to that, not again as the road that you should take, but one that we did. And our process was basically like, we hired our first employee, part-time bartender, and I quickly realized that filing payroll taxes was incredibly challenging. And that triggered me to hire a payroll company. And then that payroll company triggered me to download a really generic HR handbook and employee manual from the internet and be like, I think this will work okay. And then it was like a lot of just trial and error. And we have been like fortunate that nothing has blown up in our face because of that. Then it was a couple of years ago that, I had been managing all of the HR, and I have zero HR background, that we finally looked to an HR consultant and brought in somebody who was part-time, didn't, officially work for us, worked for a third-party HR company, and really started to help us, like analyze things like our handbook. We started working with an employment attorney because we had a couple small issues pop up that clearly we were not knowledgeable enough or didn't have the experience to handle, like a workers' comp issue, for example. And so those two kind of people started to really educate us on what we didn't know, and educate us on the fact that we had other things to focus on in this business and really needed professionals to assist. And so today I'm happy to report that, and she's actually on the Zoom, I didn't know she was joining it. We have Laura, who is our full-time HR manager. And she's somebody now that will bring up, hey, I was looking at the handbook and like, I think we should add this, like a whistleblower policy, say. And so she has our back, both as an employer, but then she also has like the backs of our employees, which is a really cool dynamic that I wish we had invested in much earlier in our business. Somebody that can advocate for both sides, if you will, when they don't line up perfectly, because often they don't.
That is huge what you just said, because the HR function is an advocate for both, and it's a delicate line that is balanced there, and it's a tightrope. And my philosophy has always been, if you do things right from the very beginning, that it makes the HR piece a little easier, because you can advocate on the side of the business, you can advocate on the side of the employee. But if you got manuals and processes and steps of corrective action in place, you have the luxury of advocating for the area on the side of the employee, because you've invested a lot in that employee to get them up to speed to even be in your corrective action process. And there's a whole nother reset that people don't pay attention to as to what that costs in your bottom line. And so when I counsel people, I tell them, how much did it cost for you to hire that person? And so do you really want to fire them, or do you want to correct their behavior? And if you get a person who corrected their behavior, that also is visible within your organization. So the advocacy that an HR person brings to the table is a lot of times undervalued.
Well, and I think those are really great points that both of you just made. And at the end of the day, Jess isn't in the business of, being an HR person. She's in the business of selling beer. And if there are things that are taking away from that, then, that's a bad fact. And so anything that she can do in her organization can do to make those things smoother, to make those things take less time, to make those things take less time for her and for Doug and for Tim or whoever else that are out there slinging beer, that's important. And so you can't just look at, oh, I can't afford to do this because of whatever, or I don't have time to do this. You don't have time not to do it. You can't afford not to do it, because at the end of the day, when you're sucked into something that's taking all your time and you're not out there, pounding the pavement for the brand, you'll remember that and be like, damn, I should have done that.
That is so true. So true. Well, Jess, you had mentioned, doing it yourself for a while, and oh, wow, wish we had invested in an HR professional earlier. But what kind of advice would you provide? Hey, you have this, I have a small business. It's just me. I plan to hire an HR professional. It's in my business model. When I get to this amount in sales or whatnot, what are steps that I can do prior to hiring, contracting with someone, bringing in someone part-time or eventually a full-time person? If I want to start that employer manual, what do I go to, besides taking a class at AB Tech on HR? Do I go to the internet and get the manual, like you said? Do I go to SHRM? What's something that I can do right now in prep for contracting with someone to help me, a professional?
Yeah, I definitely think potentially your payroll company, while they are certainly not an HR company by any stretch of the imagination, might have some of those resources established that, again, you're going to get a more generic handbook. So you definitely want to maybe compare some of that and do some internet research to see where it applies. I think, yes, like a class, or not simple, but a class at somewhere would probably be super informative. I think knowing where your company lands with regards to regulations, so like how many employees do you have, and because if it's 1 to 10 or 1 to 50 or over 50, things will start to get triggered from a regulation standpoint, and that will need updating your handbook, and you just need to be aware of that. And then, it really is a live and learn situation beyond that, where employee issues or questions would come up, and then it's like let me get back to you on that, and then you ask other breweries or other business owners, if you have an attorney friend. That's always great. They're like doctor friends, right, Derek? You probably love that. And just, utilizing, your community resources in the business community to see what other people have gone through. Like I remember years ago meeting with the HR manager at Wicked Weed for coffee to pick her brain about a couple things that we had going on at the time that didn't seem necessarily ready to elevate to an attorney or to an HR professional, but I definitely felt like I didn't know what I was doing. So I think, payroll company to start, living and learning, and then utilizing your community resources and classes and such would be really helpful.
Well, Jessica, that's a great point about utilizing other folks in your industry. And if there is a association such as the Asheville Brewers Alliance, or you know other folks, you're not, yeah, you might be competing selling beer, but really you're a bigger than that, and you're a community and reaching out. And people generally want to share information to help people win. So I think sometimes people forget about that. So thank you for sharing. What about, how can a business owner, they're in business, they don't have any HR policies, what can they do to help mitigate any type of legal risk prior to getting that policy in place? Is it legal to say, but this person signed this document, that should cover me? I mean, is there anything people can do to help mitigate their risk in respect to HR prior to?
I would say all the things that, in fact, the whole theme of my comments, and I'm sure Kevin's and probably Justice too today, are geared towards mitigating those risks. And as a very general truism, the earlier that you address it, the cheaper and more effective it is. And so if I can prevent the risky behavior, that costs me, next to nothing, and it's very, very safe. If I'm trying to fix it after it's already happened, that's the most expensive way to fix something, right? So, that's what we're trying to do. The earlier that you can afford to address it and that you pay attention to it, just the cheaper it's going to be. Like, there's no other way to say that. And along with the things that, I keep harping on having this handbook, because I think that's really a baseline. And, I think that if you're starting a business and you don't have that, you're going to have employees and you choose to not have an employee handbook, I think you're making a mistake. I just do. I think that's a mistake. I think that is, $1,000 or $1,200, well spent. That's the kind of insurance policy that you need. I promise you, it will pay in dividends. But with that, the other part is the application of those things. And application of those things mean things like having a policy of hiring slowly and firing quickly. When there's an issue, you have to do it quick. But hire slowly. I mean, take your time in doing that, because hiring the wrong person has with it all kinds of time and risk on the backside. I mean, that's a huge piece of it. And then once you hire those folks, you have to put them through training, especially in the brewery context and taproom concept. And there's tons and tons and tons of free training out there for these folks. You can do it through the ABC, you can do it through the ALE, you can do it through the Asheville Brewers Alliance. Folks like me, for my clients, I provide free training as often as they want it during the year. Anytime they want it, I'll come train their employees, because it makes them be a better client for me and keeps them out of trouble. And I don't want them to be in trouble. It's super easy to do. And it's not just the ABC training part that goes with that, but it's also training their behavior. And as an employer, you can tell through those training exercises and applications of those who are going to be good employees and who aren't. And as you start to see those things, either you fix it and correct that behavior like Kevin was talking about, or you try to figure out a way to eliminate it and mitigate it.
Yeah. I always tell people, would you build a house without your foundation being laid properly? And to me, for many years, HR was seen as just paper pushers. And that's why my company is called Strategic HR Business Partner, because we have morphed into, well, I have, and most of the professionals I know have morphed into more of a strategic business partner rather than the paper pusher. So we're coming at it from a risk mitigation standpoint to begin with. And so if you don't have those things and those processes in your brain, I think it's a big mistake before you ever serve that first beer, that you don't have those things in place, because those things are part of the foundational elements of running a business. And I think that's becoming more grassroots, and I hear people still talking about it. I get calls from people a lot saying, hey, what would you suggest for this? And I tell them, hey, this is what I suggest, but you also need to do these other things, because those things are foundationally important. So I mirror what Derek said fully. And I mean, if you hire a consultant on the front end, it's going to be well worth your time on the back. It's the truth. And if you have the vision of where you're going to be in a year from now, and you set those mile markers and those milestones for action, those are the kind of things that when you know you can interject those types of resources for your success.
Yeah, and I'm gonna give Kevin something he can use when he's giving his pitches to clients and potential clients, and that is, people will tell me all the time, we don't have an operating agreement, for example, or we don't have employee policies. I'm like, yeah, you got both those things, even if you don't have a written document. It's called what the law writes in for you. So you've got an operating agreement, you've got employee policies. It's just that you didn't pick them and the state picked them for you, and you don't know what they are. So choose them, be deliberate about them, and make them part of your culture.
Yeah, things like ADA and FMLA, all those acronyms that come up, man, those things will cause you a nightmare if they're not handled properly. FMLA, ADA, all work in conjunction with one another, and those nuanced differences can lead you down the road to perdition if you're not careful of how you interpolate the law and how you administer those particular policies. And
Oops, we lost you.
yeah, I hit my mute button too soon because I have to mute myself sometimes as I get started quickly.
Yeah, I'm just gonna.
he's got big old man fingers, man. That's what it is. You should see him type.
Oh Lord. And I'll just kind of round out what they're saying with, like, specific to the brewing industry or the alcohol beverage industry. I mean, we are just by definition a highly regulated industry. And so what's interesting, again, in hindsight, when I started, I paid a whole lot of attention to that aspect. And when you think about it, being an employer is also just a highly regulated dynamic. And so treating it the same with the same vigilance from the beginning will, yes, save you from the ALE fines, for example, when it comes to like alcohol regulation. We want to avoid those, but then we kind of miss the HR employer regulation sometimes.
Well, when that business owner's ready to hire an HR professional, what are some traits? What do they need to look for?
I'm just going to name everything that Laura is, since she's on this call. No, but what I was looking for in an HR person was, somebody who, there's kind of like two parts for me. There's kind of like the practical analytical part, and then there's the like person quality part, right? So it's like, you look for somebody, and one of the parts is more teachable than the other, right? So like there's the compliance piece, can be taught, right? But it's definitely important to have somebody who has a baseline understanding and like a thirst to find it out and understands then how to apply it to your business. I think, somebody who is detail oriented and also loves documenting, somebody who is a people person who's approachable, is incredibly important. I think somebody who can hold people accountable. I think that ultimately, one of the goals for us when hiring HR manager was certainly to have somebody to help regulate the employer-employee dynamic, but is also to help shape our culture going forward, and to listen to both the employees and the employers. There's that advocacy part again on what that looks like. What does that mean for everybody? Like, we have core values that we've set as owners, but having somebody, number one, that can help us like revisit that on a yearly basis, because just because those core values applied last year, a lot can happen, doesn't mean they apply going forward. And then to help us, to help the employees either understand what those core values are, or to listen to them on whether or not they feel like that feels genuine to the culture. Because as an employer, we have a very different vantage point than our employees do, and that there's just no way to change that. We all have our own perspectives, and so it's bringing somebody in that can really kind of bear that weight of like listening to everyone, because not everybody's cut out for that, and so those are the qualities that I looked for in Laura.
I think she's hit the nail on the head, because there are about 30 core competencies that are out there that describe what an effective HR person would be for your organization. And of those 30, you probably should pick about 10 of those. And that's how I go about it. If depending on what your core values are, how your mission looks, what your mission statements are like, then, it's stuff like learning on the fly, interpersonal savvy, managerial courage, financial acumen. Those are just a few of those things, those competencies that have been identified, which are readily available on the SHRM website. And then as you are making a decision about who you want on your team, I would refer to those kinds of competencies so that it can get those to align with your core values. And that's what a consultation with a professional could help you with whenever you're starting your business. So, we just have a session about what is it that you want to accomplish? What are your core values? What is your mission statement? And what is your outcome? And from that, you can pick from the core value lists, which are well-defined, and figure out how you want to address your HR process. Now, most of us do possess a little bit of all of those competencies because that's what's important to us. But there are some that are going to be more important to you. And that way you can figure out through your interview process of your HR person, how they line up with those things. So I'm a big believer in core competencies.
And I just had a couple things onto that. And, we talk about HR, some of it depends on the size of your organization, certainly size of your intended payroll. But, we talk about HR, it's a whole bunch of different things. I mean, it's everything from payroll to benefits to compliance issues, policies, implementation of policies, day-to-day pieces dealing with employees, hiring and firing. All those things can be inside of HR. And so you got to pick and choose, which part of those things you may offload to someone who's just going to handle payroll, for example. Or if you can't, whatever you're making that year isn't going to justify having a full-time HR position. Perhaps it is, you consulting with a fractional HR director that you meet with, every other month, once a quarter, every month, whatever it, makes some sense. But I think there are ways to do that where you are checking those boxes without going out and hiring a full-time, HR person, because I think that can be daunting. But while I'm addressing that, we started our law firm a year ago, and one of our partners was handling just tons and tons and tons of HR stuff. And I was like, look, dude, I was like, what's your hourly rate? And he tells me his hourly rate. I was like, this is the most expensive HR person on the planet. Like, stop doing that. Go build time, and we'll hire someone to deal these things that does it the day-to-day basis. If we can't hire that person, then we'll do it on a fractional basis until we can.
Mm-hmm. Well, you all mentioned, how your core values and mission statement, and that's a good segue into our next question. What can early stage companies do to set a precedent for being more diverse, inclusive, and equitable?
Don't be racist. There's one. Don't be racist. Don't be an asshole. There's two. You like those?
Those are two good ones. I mean, that's top of my list.
Yeah, well, and that's part of, man, that's, I mean, we can get into a pretty deep conversation about that. I've talked at length with Kevin about this. I've talked at length with Lee about this. We've all been through lots of different training of pieces like that. But, understanding that that kind of concept for everyone, even, the person on the planet who is the most aware of diversity and inclusion issues, it's still going to be a process that, you've got to get better at. But making, I think that the big piece is, and this is what we do in our firm, is recognizing that it's a goal and recognizing it's something that's important to our organization, and that we're open to a conversation, and we're going to fuck up and make mistakes. Sorry for language. We're going to make mistakes on that. But we're open to learning from those mistakes, and we've got an open ear. I think that's a big piece about it. And Kevin and I have had this conversation a bunch. I mean, we're in a place that's super duper white, super duper male, and in this particular industry, notwithstanding our panel here, craft beverage industry is by and large white males, and so recognizing that reality is that's the first step in my book, and then we can have a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly am not an expert on this topic. I can speak to kind of what Burial's journey has been, and it's a new one you know, as far as like an awareness piece goes, as well as like a implementation, in it being an important focal point for our organization. And you know, and for us, you know, we're kind of starting with ownership and leadership. We've certainly voiced our views, and our goals regarding, you know, DEI and the work that we plan on doing. And kind of our next step, in our journey is, yes, like how do we take the ownership leadership process, the trainings that we're doing and the conversations that we're having, and how do we start to integrate that into the culture in a meaningful way, and in a way that, you know, will benefit everybody on staff. Because when you think about the benefits of diversity, inclusivity, and equity, you know, it certainly is about celebrating everybody's voice. And you know, we've started to analyze, and so I think this could be something that can be done in early stages, are those like aspects of white supremacy. And you know, so we sat down a couple weeks ago and went through them all, and you're like, oh wow, perfectionism, yep, that shows up a whole lot, you know, or like sense of urgency, yep, that. And so to be able to like articulate and talk about where those things show up for you as a leader, maybe in your own life, and then as well as like where does it then manifest in the culture, has been a great step for us. And I think an exercise that can really be done at any point in your business, and certainly in the beginning, to set the stage culturally for what you want that culture to look like. 'Cause it's going to be easier to set it from the beginning than it is 8 years down the road and being like, okay, well, we've been you know, praising urgency or people that respond to urgency for the past 8 years. You know, how do we start to like get people to calm down, because we've calmed down, and because they can start to trust in us as leaders that we're not buying into that anymore. So I think, yeah, doing that from the beginning would be huge.
Um, I work for the Biltmore, right? And part of my challenge there is the fact that the brand itself is a bit exclusive. How do you address that? So you, from a already established viewpoint, some of the things I'm having to do is start back at ground zero, doing some assessments of some things that you can assess. There are several assessments out there that will give you an idea of where you are in your thought process around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I would suggest that everyone on this call, if you've not done that, do that. Do the Harvard study thing. That will also give you a good idea of what barometer you might use for where you are. But diversity, equity, and inclusion also talks about not just diversity of race, gender, and those things, but we're talking about diversity of thought processes. We're talking about diversity of different ability people. How do we give access and equitable access to those to those people who are in that genre? So there's a whole lot of things that we think about in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so a lot of people tend to think it's only a couple of things. So that's my first warning to you. It encumbs a whole lot of things. And at the Biltmore, you know, we don't even allow tattoos. And that's causing us a problem in hiring, right? Your tattoo cannot be visible. So how do we address that? That's directly in conflict with some of our branding, right? So we either have to look at the branding or move, because we live in Asheville. Everybody's got a tattoo, right? So, so we need to become very, very, very careful of how we approach that. Number two, I would suggest that you also look at some of your wording in your job descriptions, okay? Stuff like, and I think Leah have heard me say this before, ideal candidate would possess these qualities. And if you already under the gamut of not being ideal in the first place, accepted by society, then you may self-eliminate, even though you may have the qualities that you have already expressed for the job. So there's a lot of self-elimination that happens, and there is no shortage of diversity. You just don't have the outreach to reach them. And so you have to identify those avenues that will get you to those diverse communities, to get you to those diverse thought processes. And that comes from partnering with your, say, Goodwill, because they have an access to different ability people. They have access to people who are in rehab for a lot of things. They have access to people who are coming out of the penal system, which we know does not rehabilitate. The rehabilitation is left up to people like us to give them an opportunity so that they don't go back in jail when they don't have an opportunity out here in the streets. That's all diversity, and diversity of thought, and diversity of how you think about how you would hire someone. So diversity, equity, inclusion is a large animal. And I applaud you, Jessica, for your undertaking, because I have people when I walk around downtown, you guys have seen me on my motorcycle. I know I ride an orange motorcycle. I park right in front of Barrel with my music blaring, and I'm like an attraction that comes up. But everybody is really liking that. But that's one thing I do so that I can have a common ground. So you got to figure those kinds of things out to attract the people you want to attract. So take a look at your job description, take a look at your job postings, take a look at where you are posting your jobs. Take a look at the assessments that are out there to assess where you are and use those as tools. But that's a whole nother conversation. That's really big to get into in an hour, but those are some of the bottom line things. And we do have a problem here in Asheville. We talk diversity. We are diverse in thought and I would call us more adaptable and more accepting, because I have people who move here and say, man, where are all the Black people? Where are all the Hispanic people? Because we're hidden. And so how do we get that hidden population into your breweries and your businesses? And you have to speak their language, you know? You might have to use some slang or whatever it is you think might reach someone, which might be against your brand, but what are you trying to accomplish in the end is a question you always need to ask yourself when it comes to diversity hiring, because you cannot have inclusion if you don't have diversity. You can't have diversity, equity, and inclusion. They go in that order. And then belonging is the last step in that. So if a person is already 4 steps out, no diversity, they're never going to feel like they belong. And those are the things that help you in your retention efforts. And that's what gets you a good reputation in the community for being a diverse employer.
Well,
Hey,
and
Kevin, is that the implicit association test that you were referring to from Harvard?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Okay.
And
Thanks.
we'll put that link in the chat. I know a few people have asked about that. And also, in respect to some of these assessments and studies that you have mentioned, we do have some local resources that can help too. With Dwayne, I'm going to put you on the spot, but do you want to mention a little bit about Aisha Adams' program at Lenore Rhine, or there's
Of which
a lot of different
I teach a diverse. I am one of the instructors of that.
Yeah, you can speak about
very
that.
good.
Yeah, there we go.
Perfect.
I do a module around having a plan around diversity hiring processes. And we will be, and I'm a plug us right now. We will be starting back up in February. So go on Lenore Ryan's website if you're interested. What I do is help people come up with a plan so that they can have diversity, equity, and inclusion considered in how you recruit. Aisha we also have 3 others. I don't know if you know, these Dr. Fox, you know, Dr. Fox is also
Yes, Dr. Joseph Fox.
Yeah. And our old friend from Green Opportunities, Joseph Hackett is also one of the instructors. And he has, if you know his story, it's very unique because he did come out of the penal system and he's very proud of it. But who he is now is no reflection of who he was or may have been. But we have a whole array of training that goes for the weekend that talks about, and we are targeting young entrepreneurs and giving them these same kinds of basic tools so that you won't get off on the wrong foot. And Aisha is a branding expert. I mean, this lady is a dynamo in the branding and helping you get your stuff on track from a branding standpoint. And she's the spearhead of the whole thing. So, yeah. And also, we have the Western North Carolina Diversity Coalition. You can join that. That's a very good organization. We bring to front the issues in the area. We try to give out information. So the Western North Carolina Diversity Coalition is a great resource that deals with that specifically.
Yeah, thank you for all those resources. I mean, just speaking as an owner of a company, just tapping into some of those sound really great. And I think since we're talking about like startups, those are also really amazing options because like while Burial 8 years in has been able to engage with a one-on-one DEI trainer, they're not. That wouldn't necessarily be a part of a startup's budget, right? Depending on what that looks like for you. And so having these resources to tap into, and there's been so many amazing webinars that some of these DEI trainers, like her name is escaping me, have offered webinars. So for $75, $100, they're offering webinar series as well on diversity, equity, inclusivity training, which again are great resources if you can't invest thousands of dollars in somebody for that.
One of the best resources you do have, though, is anybody can join SHRM, Society of Human Resources Management. That is one of the best organizations that dispenses all kinds of information and a whole plethora and a whole gamut of things that you would need to know as a startup. So even if you're not in HR, I think every owner of a business ought to be a member of SHRM just so they could get access to the information, and it's there if you need it. And there's all kinds of professionals, free webinars, some of them cost more, some cost less, but it is a great resource. I would definitely say a startup should put that in their budget. It's like $225 a year. It's a very, very small investment to keep you on track. And then from there, you have access to a whole network of professionals that willingly give you advice.
And we'll get that link and put it in the chat. Another resource often overlooked is the community college and workforce development customized training. So as an entrepreneur is adding employees, even if it's 5 or 6, if they need to be trained in a certain area, the community college can help with that. We have folks in our division who do that, and also in helping with interviewing or looking for an apprenticeship. So there are multiple ways that folks can come into the community college system and how AB Tech can help, or any one of our 58 community colleges. As we remain on the topic of DEI, what are some unintentional things that organizations do that could lead to a culture of systemic racism? In other words, how does an entrepreneur avoid planting the seeds that can lead to a culture that lacks diversity and inclusiveness?
Oof, so many things.
That's a big one, isn't it?
Yeah. And and I am admittedly somebody through my recent journey. There are a lot of unintentional things in our organization that I had no idea that we were perpetuating. So again, in hindsight, it's 2020. I think I'm going to put this list of kind of white supremacists or I'm like a lost words, characteristics of white supremacy culture. And like I said, I think that a lot of folks would be able to pinpoint a couple that you might, from a personality standpoint, like gravitate toward, because ultimately we're all conditioned in this society to gravitate towards many of these. And so it just unintentionally shows up in that way. So it's kind of hard to, I guess, for me, articulate without knowing. How do you know?
Right. How do you know if you don't know? What do you?
Right. Yeah. So, so I think a lot of us this year were hit over the head. While it's so unfortunate that it comes at the expense of people's lives and well-being, you can only just hope that, through the awareness, whatever was once unintentional becomes intentional and then can be undone. Right. So that's, again, kind of where we're at personally as a business. So it's hard for me to speak to, like, how do you prevent that when you don't know?
Well, I think you just hit it, and I'm gonna kick it over to Kevin because this, I bet, matches up with what he sees day in and day out. But one of the things I was going to say, you did absolutely just nailed it, and that is, you can't see your own biases, and you can't see outside your own paradigm. you just can't. And so you have to recognize that you can't do that. And so you have to bring people in from outside that have different perspective than you to say, hey, why don't you take a look at what we're doing here? Take a look at how we operate. Take a look at how we run this business and tell us what we're missing. Tell us where we're being obtuse. Tell us where we're being, not inclusive, not equitable. Identify these issues for us. And then here's the hard part. You got to be willing to listen to that and apply it. And it's not fun to listen to. Like, it's not fun to listen to because your immediate reaction is, but that, that's not really what we are. And, that's not the time to do that. That's the time to shut up and listen to it, sleep on it, come back to it a week later, be like, okay, I can see that. I can see that now. And then you can start to get better, because you can't get better till you have a problem.
I also, in everything they've said has been on point. The hardest part is when you have a workforce that doesn't accept where they are. And that's why I think the assessments and those things, when you put those out to your workforce, is very important, because it becomes a mirror. And if anybody has any sense of integrity about themselves and will answer questions honestly, and if you have hired the right people, that will be prevalent. So when you answer those questions and when you do that self-introspection, if someone is honest with themselves, they'll come to the conclusion, even me, recognizing that you have those biases. Some of them are implicit, some are complicit, but they are there. And addressing those biases is what it should happen. It's okay to be where you are, but just know where you are is probably not where you should be. And I think everyone is on a self-actualization learning journey. And if you are on that journey, and I think most of us are, and most of the people you hire, there are questions that you can ask to see if they are, because those are the kind of people who will establish your culture. And so, yeah, I agree with everything everyone says, but owning it is the biggest thing that you can do.
Well, and another hard part, and I talked about this when we were doing this in Leaf. I served as president of the board for Leaf for 2 years, and this is very, this topic that we're now talking about was very important, obviously for lots of reasons inside Leaf. And one of the things that I identified was I felt like I should know the answers to these things. And so being able to say honestly that, I'm in the beginning stage of my journey, or not where I wanted to be on the journey, to people out loud was very difficult for me to do, and humbling to be able to say, hey man, I'm just learning about this stuff, but I'm open, help me. And what I found was folks that are further along in that journey in their education, were like, yes, that's it. Yes. Well, let's have this conversation. It's going to be tough. And, you put the work in, it's going to be tough, but you got to be able to say, I don't know this, man. Tell me.
Yeah, I think what's ironic that what I've found is that those white supremacist characteristics show up in equity journeys. And like, that is, also where you're like, no, like, I want to do it well, and I want to do it right, and I don't want to make mistakes. Or the like, we need to fix this now, and that all stems back to like the cycle that we're all perpetuating. And that so many aha moments, right? But that's definitely one I think worth noting.
And there's going to be a point in your journey where you're going to be overcompensating. And then that turns into some tokenizing. And I want you to be aware of that, because one of the worst things you can do on this journey is have one report back to you. Doesn't matter who it is, doesn't matter what color, what ability they have, but there's a tendency to overcompensate. And then that can be a fine line between tokenizing and really embracing those changes in yourself. So yeah, and you're going to stumble along the way. That's the thing. And it's going to take 5 years for your company to kind of turn around if you're already on that journey. But if you embark upon it, and it's got to be part of what you do. It ought to be part of what you measure. And any business that doesn't measure progress is a business that will fail. And this equity journey has to be measured as well.
That brings up a good question. I'll ask a question to the other panelists. What measurements, how do you measure that, Kevin? Help me articulate that, in my brain.
Well, there's some, employee surveys are really big. If you give people the autonomy and the confidentiality, that what they're going to be saying is going to be taken to heart and not be, I don't know, some kind of reactive some kind of reaction that's not favorable, I think employee surveys are the most important thing, because I can tell you, since 2018, we've added equity, diversity, and inclusion questions on our employee survey at the Biltmore. And those surveys is really what opened the eyes to the upper level management that we had a problem. And so I think those surveys is one of the things you measure. And if you get, and there's all kind of calculations you get from that. And if you score below a certain level, you need to decide what that is. You need to have an action plan in place to see if you are doing stuff. And if you go too far below a level, then you do a pulse survey to make sure that you have those action plans implemented and acting upon and getting the results that you want. So for me, an employee survey, open door policies, forming, if you have the time and the effort, forming focus groups within your organization and see but you gotta have diversity for that, you know? So, and there was a story about, I forget, it was one large food manufacturing company that had these focal groups, and they had Hispanics on this focal group. And the upper management thought that they were doing a good job in reaching that Hispanic community through their marketing efforts. But when they had this focus group, the feedback they got was, hey, all these things you're showing us, the stereotypical things that you advertise are not reaching us. We're turning that off. So reach us in a way that makes us equal in your advertising. We want to be represented, but we don't want to be pigeonholed because you think we always eat guacamole, you know? So that came out. And so the management structure did a course correct at the urging of that committee, and they found that their sales went up. And that's another thing you can find. You can measure your sales, because if your diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff is not impacting your sales, then you're doing something wrong. So you got to monitor your sales based on those prongs that come from that diversity effort. And then you can have another barometer of that. Those are 2 or 3 things that you can do. Here's another interesting one. At the Biltmore, you know, we have a winery, and thank God for that, because that's what's got us through this COVID. And people were drinking a lot of liquor and wine during the COVID, right? But we had a little study, and we had a focus group, and we found that the sweeter wines were not selling as well as some of our other wines. And so we started looking at what the marketing efforts were. We weren't even marketing those sweet wines in the communities that like the sweeter wines. They haven't even identified that. They don't have the cross-pollination of thought process to even think that we might need to do a different kind of ad campaign in DeKalb, Georgia. Let's advertise that in DeKalb and see what happens, because you have Black people. We don't like that kind of wine. We like kind of sweeter stuff for the most part, as do Hispanics. They hadn't done that market research, but when they did it, that's what they found. And so during this pandemic, that's one of the things we could measure. And we saw that thing go up like this in sales, just because of that marketing in that community to a specific community, and they understood it. So to the brewers, if you have something, and this may sound, if you have something that you need to do a focus project on, what do the diverse communities like? Because not everybody likes IPAs, not everybody likes the wheat beer. You're missing out on a big market by not understanding what that palette looks like and what it requires. So I brought many of folks to downtown. They didn't like that craft beer, and I had like 16 motorcyclists with me. We spend money. I mean, we probably had $100 tab wherever we landed a piece. That's just in a couple of hours. So don't forget about that. Those kinds of aspects when you are brewing your beer. You know, get a taster in there. Hey, do you think your population would like this? There's nothing wrong with that. But be intentional. I said that the last time I talked. Be intentional in your stuff, but be authentic with that intention.
Well, and really, when you're
I love hearing Kevin. I think he's self-muted again, but I love hearing Kevin.
I couldn't hear you, Derek.
Derek's muted too.
We're frozen.
He may be frozen.
I'm off mute now.
Oh, there he is.
You
Worse
got
than
me.
he did. He's frozen.
That was you, Derek.
My back live.
It's still a bit choppy. We can't hear you. You're a little frozen. He'll come back in a minute. Are you back on, Derek?
There's movement.
He may be like Dwayne and pretend to be frozen
What do you
when
think?
he's
Testing?
talking to me.
Am I there?
Yeah.
Frozen?
Well,
I can hear you.
I'm just frozen.
Sometimes.
All right. I'll type my point out.
We can't hear you.
we can hear you.
You're like
Oh.
an old like kung fu movie right now.
There? Am I still moving?
Derek, pay your internet bill next time.
Well, this is all great. I mean, it's great information.
I got it on dial-up, man. I'll type the point out.
Okay. Thank you. And gosh, if we can get our entrepreneurs just as they're starting out to integrate this and approach the start of their business with that, it permeates every single aspect of their business and just really provides a better foundation for them to be sustainable. Well, as we're waiting on that, I'm going to move. I mean, this is such great dialogue. I am going to, as we're waiting for that question, Derek, move to another question. Can you speak about the importance of building a reliable staff early on as opposed to midway through the growth stage or even maturity stage?
I would say reliability, at least for us, is integrated into core values that we created about 2 years ago under the guise of professionalism. But I was actually just pinging Laura on here saying we need to reevaluate those core values as it relates to our DEI work to make sure, again, that we're not perpetuating white supremacist culture. But I mean, reliability is so huge from team culture. If you have somebody like to me, the example comes to mind, like somebody doesn't show up to work on time, so if you don't have a reliable person, then it starts to create tension within the culture and it starts to break down, team dynamics from a manager to, employee. I think it can trigger micromanaging. That's definitely from my own personal experience, but I've definitely through chatting with other managers and employers, it's something where if the person's not being reliable, i.e. not following through on, tasks that they say that they're going to do or that they're assigned, you start to become concerned that things aren't getting done. And then you start to step in more, which isn't necessarily the healthy response. I'm not advocating for that, but it starts to again, break down the intention and the culture and the flow of communication and accountability. And so I think, if you're going to have unreliable employees from time to time. If you don't, then you are just blessed beyond. And so the real point is that how do you handle unreliable employees? And so how do you as an employer hold yourself accountable or as a manager or as a teammate to both creating conflict resolution steps to address unreliable employees so that it remains productive, that there are, if it's another teammate that's impacted, they know that there are steps within the business that will be taken to resolve the impact that they are now experiencing because of that unreliable employee. So really, I think it's reliable employees are great, or just being reliable as a human being is great, but we're not always all reliable. Sometimes it could be a personality trait. Sometimes it's this person is going through a really hard time in their life, which is causing them to be unreliable. That they're not necessarily a unreliable employee or person. However, during that time, it still is impacting efficiency, workflow. Other people are having to maybe work longer hours, and that's just not sustainable. So I think it's setting up and understanding, if you have 50 or more employees, understanding FMLA, if there's that hardship period in somebody's life, and if you need to put somebody on leave, and being fully informed of, again, what can come with the various aspects of what unreliability and how that can manifest in your company. So I think it's tuning into it early, looking to document, and trying to not create a sense of urgency from the unreliability, as long as people are not placed in an unsafe or harmful situation, both emotionally and physically. But ensuring you have steps in place to address that, for sure.
I always say that people send their representative for the first 90 days of their employment. You know what I mean? So you have to have something in whatever your probationary period is a time frame for which, and you should have a probationary period for your employees, and an understanding that if your performance is not up to par, then we're a right to work state anyway, but you don't have a right not to be sued. So what I'm telling you here is a mitigation step, is in your probationary period, you tell them you can be terminated for missing a day, or whatever your parameters may be. And that sets the stage for the expectation early. I think a lot of companies don't do that. They don't catch that performance early enough, like to Jessica's point, because if most people want to do a good job, that's what I found in my 32 years of doing this. Most people want to do a good job. The policies that we make are only for 5% of the population, and the other 95% want to do a good job. And that's the thing you got to remember. You got to deal with that 5% early, though. So to her point, Jessica's point, if you deal with it early, because they're like a cancer. If you let them stay around too long, it's going to spread, and people are going to be disenfranchised and demotivated. And engagement, there's a lot of things around engagement, which is what we're talking about. Those things all add to the engagement practices and the engagement factors.
Are 90 days typical, or do some people, some companies may not even have that sort of trial period? And I love what you said, Kevin, that's really, you're mitigating on the front end, you're being proactive. Is 90 typical, or is it 45, or it just depends?
It depends on the company. I mean, at the Biltmore, we have 120 days, which is too long, so we're going to change that to 90 and probably go back to 60. 60 days, if you don't know if somebody's going to make it within 60 days, then your management staff has a problem, so that's how I look at it. But yeah, I would think some kind of probationary period. And if you have benefits, talk those benefits. That's a reason for people to stay around too. Look, you're going to be forfeiting your benefits if you don't come to work. I also taught attendance policies. Attendance sometimes, have a policy in place for attendance, whether it's if you miss 5 days, 2 days, 1 day, but let it be prescriptive so that everybody knows where they are at any given point in the process. So if you have a policy that says if you're late 3 times in a month, you get a first corrective or first written warning, then let that be that, and just follow that. And let it be prescriptive until I use a 3-strike rule usually, because that's what the ESC likes to see, that we've given somebody an opportunity to change their behavior, and 3 times is generally the accepted amount. If you skip steps, you better have a really good reason and have very good documentations to do that. But if you have a cancer, it's like anything else, you need to extract it as soon as possible. If you have somebody who's just a little sick, maybe a little coaching and those kinds of things will direct them to becoming a really good employee. And that's why that probationary period is really important. Can I have that package, Leah? I don't know what it is.
All right, very good. And you all mentioned the importance of that communication to your employees. And what are some ways and surveys, employee survey, getting a lot of good information from that? What are additional ways that you communicate with your staff? Is it regular team meetings, or once a month, team building? What are things that you do to build that cohesiveness and trust that you need with your employees?
I think daily, from my perspective, I encourage daily communication and daily touching bases, because one of the things you find in employee surveys is that my management staff does not recognize me enough. Number one, they don't take a real concern about me advancing in the company. Number two, and then pay becomes the third thing. Pay is never the top thing on the list why people leave. They leave because of managers, okay? And so if you have a manager that's engaging the employees daily on a positive note, that's gonna go eons further, and you won't even see a lot of corrective action processes happen. So I encourage daily meetings, and a communication from the top dog would be good, because a downward communication about what's happening. And I think transparency is a huge thing, because everybody wants to know they work for a viable company. And if you have surprises down the road and they see stuff in the news and you didn't tell them, that's going to be a problem for you. So I think transparency and communication is really huge, even with your financials. I mean, you don't have to tell them every nut and bolt, but enough to where they got a place to come to work next week. So those things are really important for engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. We just took a training, a conflict training with a local gentleman, and he started out by saying that employees don't quit companies, they quit managers, which made my heart sink a little, I'm not gonna lie. But it's true, and it's engagement is important. I think that there is, like everything in life, can be like a fine line of making sure that you're involving, being respectful of people's time and involving the people that need to be involved in meetings, because I'm an over communicator. And so I sometimes have to dial it back a little bit to ensure that people do feel like their time is valued, and that they're not just being wrapped up in conversations that don't necessarily apply to them. But I think you come up with a strategy of, yes, daily check-ins, which are just hey, how's it going today? And then there can be, weekly meetings, which is a little more what are you working on? What are your roadblocks? How can I support you as a manager? And then you can do maybe bigger, monthly roundups, that might feel a little more casual, post-COVID. And so I think it is being strategic sometimes about your communication. Not that you have to totally come at it from a robot standpoint, and that you can't humanize that dynamic, but I think it helps with accountability on the manager's part if you have a structure in place on how often and when and who you communicate with. So we've definitely found that to be helpful. And we also have pretty much just a company agenda, so that we're hitting on kind of similar points each time, and that again that there's structure, and even though structure might sound corporate to some folks, especially in our industry, a lot of times the journey that we've been on, we could kind of tell that there was some resistance when we started implementing things like core values and mission statements and company agendas, because it starts to make people feel like maybe they're not working for this casual quirky brewery anymore. And sometimes I have to remind myself that they're not. They were 6 years ago, but they're not anymore. And so it's also being in tune with culturally where your business is at and its growth. So our business is in the teenager years. And so we're having to get a little more serious with some of our communications and how we structure them and how we are more intentional with them as well.
That's a great way to describe that, because we've seen that with many of our clients who start out as a small, close knit, we're in this all together. I mean, you still ultimately want to be like that as you grow, but quirky, non-corporate kind of thing. And then as the company goes through the elementary years and then the middle school, teenage years, management does have to change their approach somewhat if they want to continue on that journey. And having folks, it may not everyone can come along on that ride.
Right. Money brings problems a lot of times. So you want to make money and you want to be viable. So you got to expect sometimes that money is going to bring problems because you're going to be hiring more people, and people with people is inherent that there's issues because so also when you make a change, a policy change or a rollout of something, I've always suggested you make that change, but you announce it today and it goes into effect 45 days later to give people an opportunity to give feedback, understand what it looks like. You can abate some of the issues with private conversations. And I think if you give an explanation around the changes, it does go a long way in making it palatable for some people. So the over communication, yeah, you have to balance that, but you also want to be sure that you're giving people enough information so that they can feel comfortable with the changes if you have to make them.
Right, right. Very good. Well, I was looking at our last question, but I think this has been a central theme throughout the entire session, is pleading your case on stressing the importance of getting that HR professional help early. If that's one thing that is a huge takeaway today, that is definitely it. And does any of our participants have any questions? I know there've been a few things in the chat that have been addressed. Dwayne, anything? Oh, sorry, Leah.
Oh, it's all good. I'm curious, just because Jess is on the call and I feel like I don't ever get to see you, especially now that we're in a pandemic. This question's around, I guess if you're a brewery with multiple locations, obviously there are cultural differences in different cities. And so in terms of keeping to your organizational culture, your corporate culture, what are the challenges that are presented when you expand to other geographies, whether it's a different city or a different state, and how do you maintain that culture while also adapting to different areas?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, before I kind of speak to that specifically, when something I didn't realize when I first started a brewery was that we are basically three businesses in one. Because we also self-distribute, we're a wholesale distribution company, we're a manufacturing company, and we're a retail company. So that in and of itself can create cultural divides within those departments. Then you have like kind of admin here, but admin kind of touches on all of them. So they feel, I think, a little more integrated. So that's a challenge to just like keep those like aspects not siloed, and then you like dive deeper into the dynamics between like packaging and production, and the dynamics between like front of house, back of house. And then, like ensuring that the retail culture, while we're trying to establish different experiences at each location for the customer, that ultimately there's kind of buy-in into cultural values and processes and communication. And so with regards to Raleigh being, 4 hours away, we're actually heading there tomorrow. We, to be quite, transparent, a couple of years ago, or maybe I have no concept of time, call it a year ago, we found out that our manager at the time was not being very nice to his employees. And that and so we terminated him. And that really like made us realize that we had siloed them, and so we made a commitment. This is, and then COVID hit, but whatever. But for about, 6 months before COVID, that one of us, Doug, Tim, and I, would go out to Raleigh and, take the employees out and ensure that we were kind of showing them that they are a part of the company. And certainly like just hiring a new manager helped immensely. We have this project management software called Basecamp, which helps with its communication, right, essentially, and documentation. And so that helps Raleigh feel more connected because they are involved in communications that other people from other departments and locations are involved in. But it's definitely like a challenge and a struggle. It's not something that like I, have the answer to, because I think it does take, time and effort, and Raleigh is just a little too far to be like a convenient like day trip, you know what I mean? So it's interesting when you think about like, we're friends with Other Half Brewing, and they now have a brewery in Brooklyn, a brewery in Rochester, which is 6 hours away, and then a brewery in DC. So a completely different, state, if you will. And yeah, and I think that that's the challenge. I think in hindsight, what would have been ideal is if somebody from our Asheville culture, like our maybe like a bartender who was really thriving in Asheville, would have been willing and able to move to Raleigh to then oversee that space. I think that if you can swing that, is how you can kind of connect your culture more fluidly between locations that are in different cities or states.
Having worked for a global organization, she's exactly right. The thing you have to do is if you want to implant culture. So in the global organization, you have different divisions, and those divisions can be in different states. But what happens there is we always would send someone from the culture that's already established to start up the new entity, or if we have a turnover in one of the facilities, we do an interim process to where we would send somebody from the established culture to make sure that culture is sustained. And then when the new person comes in, there's a transfer of that culture. So those are the things that you have to do. You have to, if you want that culture to be the same, and taking in the nuances of Raleigh, because Raleigh's a more conservative town than Asheville. I have a couple of clients in Raleigh. They cause me a lot of problems. So because my mindset's not where they are. Am I right, Jessica? It's kind of like.
I mean, that's the other like cultural challenge, right? So cultural, you can look at it from like an internal culture, but then the external culture of where your business is located is hugely impactful on the internal culture. And so the challenge of how do you immerse yourself in a city that you don't live in, when you have so much going on where you do live. And so that's been a challenge, especially through the pandemic, and Raleigh experiencing a lot of trauma as a city with protests, and our industry had out there had some sexual harassment stuff come up, and in a brewery setting, not ours. And so, there was just like a lot happening, and like to be 4 hours away and so disconnected is tough.
Inside the belt line versus outside the belt line is a huge problem for you. Your clients are different there. So all those factors, when you're trying to figure out what you're doing, is going to take some studying, and that's just how it is.
Leah, that was a great question, and one that a lot of folks have to think about. Any other questions? Well, Kevin and
Can I make
Jessica.
a comment? Can I make, as to your last point, and I'm a mess with Derek here, and he can attest to this. HR is way cheaper than an attorney. That's the bottom line of it all. It really is. It really is.
What and when you pay someone like me, I get involved at the beginning in helping you set up your documents, and then hopefully you don't need me anymore. And so you call me once a year to update those documents, and we do that because if you call me on the backside and there's a problem and ask you for your HR manual or what's happened so far, because every single time you call me, there are things that you've done before that mitigate risks, whether it's training or having a good policies in place, having a good manual in place, being aware of what's going on. Then there is the event, whatever happens, right? And I don't care, it can be a singular event or a policy-driven event. And then there is a short period of time during the event and after the event where additional facts can be created. When you have me in at that point, you're paying $300 some dollars an hour on helping you create facts that should have been avoided ideally. So yeah, without a doubt, man.
And I will have one last comment also to that, like why to advocate for an HR person. And this comes from, again, the employer and like the like self-preservation piece as a business owner, that like you are going to feel so emotionally connected to every single employee and HR issue that comes up. Like it's hard to avoid it, because everything can feel like, whether it's like, oh man, like it's our fault, or oh man, that's going to impact this, even if it is like a small kind of blip on the radar. And so to have somebody there to kind of take that initial sting away, from the dynamic is hugely important, both for the employer and then for the employee, because then we don't have to know, most of the things that go on anymore. And it's great because then we don't form our own biases against our employees, and so it's hugely helpful, again, for, I think, the self-preservation of employers as time goes on and you have more and more employees, and then for the employee to feel safe and protected in the workplace when things don't, when they have a, and to encourage that they have a voice, so they can have a voice without the employer knowing that they, that they, maybe they don't want them to know. So I think it just creates like a safer space and culture for everybody.
Very good. Gosh, great information. This has been awesome. So thank you, Jess and Derek and Kevin and Dwayne, for all the hard work you put into coordinating our panelists and working with Jess and getting everything set up, and do look for more of these type of events and series in the future. So we've got great plans for 2021. And Puff, I'd love for you to say a little bit about the Craft Beverage Institute, if you would like.
I was so busy writing notes on what y'all said. I can't thank you all enough for making my job easier teaching my students, because I'm going to reiterate all the stuff you said, and I'm going to plagiarize it 100%. I'm getting paid because you guys have made my job easy. So I appreciate that. I'm glad this is going to be recorded. Dwayne, thanks to you for actually pushing record this time on time. This is one of the first times in this series, 100%, that we've actually recorded the whole thing. So pat on everyone's back at that point. But yeah, I'm the chair of the the Brewing, Distillation, and Fermentation program here at AB Tech. I'm the director of the Craft Beverage Institute of the Southeast. We're here to help any program, any winery, cidery, distillery, brewery, sake distiller, anything out in the area. What we can do to help is, again, going back to that workforce development, testing, anything that I can do to help. You let me know, and we'll figure out how to make it work. But I am stealing all of this material. I'm not going to be shy about it. I thank you guys for giving me the insight. And I always think of HR as like insurance. If you don't have it, it's too late when you need it. And it's always way too late in the idea of making sure that you actually have it. So thank you for letting me ride on the coattails of y'all and the Small Business Center and everybody here. So I appreciate you guys letting me be a part of this. And thank you all for the free information, because I'm going to be now using this in my classes. So no surprise there. I'm stealing it. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
And one last thing I want to say, I want to thank Jess, because this would have not happened without Jess. I mean, quite frankly, she came to me with this idea. She drafted this whole series. She put in the work. Jess, I really appreciate it. I wish more entrepreneurs would come to us with ideas like this, because this is great. This has got my wheels turning about some things that we're going to change for next year. So I look forward to working with you again in the future, all of you in the future. And I really thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to be a part of it and get to know everybody on panels, and you, Dwayne, and Jill, and Jeff. It's been a pleasure. So here's to 2021 and looking toward the future.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks, Kevin.
Oh,
Thanks,
gosh.
Dwayne.
Thanks, everyone. Have a healthy holiday. Bye. Thank you.